Shalom, I'm Richard Schwartz, President Emeritus of Jewish Badge, and the author of this book here, Jewish Vegan Revolution, Saving a World, Revitalizing Judaism. And this is another one of a series of podcasts I've been having, trying to interview leading environmentalists, animal rights advocates, vegetarian, vegan, social justice people. And in this podcast, we have a super special guest, Arthur Waskow, who I've known for many, many years. He's been super active. He's been a hero of mine, an inspiration to me. I've read some of his books, and I just wish there were many more. So, Arthur, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. And I'm delighted that you're doing this, not only with me, but with other people.
Well, we're trying to get the word out. There's much to be done. So you've done so much in 40 more years. Let's start by asking, what motivated you? How did you get involved? What's your history leading up to this point?
Well, I think the crucial moment that affected more than half my life was the week that followed the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King. In Washington, where I was living, and Washington, D.C., and in many other cities, Black neighborhoods erupted with sorrow and grief and rage at the murder of the most respected speaker for an actor for nonviolence in American history. So that I had been, I would say, a secular, casually Jewish. My bar mitzvah was boring, and I thought the whole thing seemed boring, so I didn't bother with anything except the Passover Seder. Because Pesach, the Seder, was about freedom and justice, and that's what was important in my family and important to me. So that, out of the whole array of Jewish practice, was the one element that really mattered to me. When Dr. King was killed and the Black community erupted, President Johnson sent the army to occupy the city of Washington, the capital of the United States. And they did occupy it. They took over schools. They took over those traffic circles where you could aim machine guns in 6 directions simultaneously. And Johnson imposed a curfew. The curfew, in theory, applied to everybody. But the police didn't really care if white folks were on the streets. There were thousands of Black folks who were arrested for no violation of anything except that they were on the streets and violating the curfew. But the police didn't care if there were whites. So white activists in the civil rights movement and the movement opposing the Vietnam War got together. We called it the Center for Emergency Support. And we got food and medical supplies and doctors and lawyers into the Black community, which otherwise was totally cut off by the curfew. And we did that night and day for at least the week after Dr. King was killed. But at the end of that week came the first night of Pesach. And I walked home ready to do what I had done since I was 5 or 6 years old, take part in the Pesach Seder. But that meant walking past the U.S. Army. And it meant ultimately walking past a Jeep with a machine gun that was pointed at the block I lived on. And my kishkis, my guts, much more than my brain, began to say, this is Pharaoh's army. I'm going home to celebrate liberation from Pharaoh, and this is Pharaoh's army on the streets. And that changed my life because it made the Seder so meaningful, so central. There's a passage in the Seder that says, in every generation, Beholdor, Kol Adam, every human being, not just every Jew, every human being is obligated to look upon himself, herself, as if we go forth from slavery to freedom, not just our great grandmommies and daddies. And I had read that line ever since I was old enough to read, but it didn't mean very much. But that night, with what was happening on the streets, it meant everything. And I felt like the Seder was in the streets and the streets were in the Seder. And the Seder became something like a volcano in your backyard that you didn't even know existed. It was so quiet. And suddenly it exploded. So that deeply affected me. And I found myself that fall, in the fall of 1968, I had been a delegate to the famous, infamous Democratic National Convention of 1968 in Chicago, which would have been utterly different except the great second murder of the year, Robert Kennedy, who could have been nominated for president and brought together the white and black working classes of the United States, was murdered, and that possibility disappeared, and it disappeared for at least 50 years and maybe more. It may still not have reappeared, that possibility. So as a delegate to the convention, I felt despair. The processes that were supposed to bring good sense and good sense and peace and justice weren't working. So I came back from Chicago to Washington with every version of who I thought I was lost, and except one. And that one was what had happened the night of the Seder. And I began exploring, and I found myself, and I put it that way because I didn't make any conscious choice. I found myself writing a radical version of the Passover Seder, a version that included not just the ancient story of liberation from Pharaoh, but also the story of Black liberation and not liberation in America, the ongoing struggle that had never ended. And Gandhi, and I took the debate among the rabbis, whether there were 10 plagues or 20 or 50 or 200 or 500, which I thought was kind of silly. And I took it out and instead constructed a debate, which seemed to me really important, between violence and nonviolence as a way of winning freedom, which was a real issue in the 60s and 70s. And then I remembered, I must have read it somewhere and it stuck, that a guy named A.J. Muste, a Christian radical pacifist and labor activist, wrote an essay on Moses, calling him the organizer of Brickmakers Union Local 1. And I thought that was wonderful and absolutely fit what I was trying to do in the Freedom Seder. So all that came together with excitement. And then I found myself doing something I'd never done. I'd written 3 books by that time, but this one was like writing me, or maybe rewriting me. And I found myself, I would write a paragraph and then call up one of my friends and say, listen. And I would read the paragraph. Half my friends said, Bosco, that's amazing, that's wonderful. And the other half said, you can't do that. There is a Haggadah. Nobody can write a Haggadah. So I thought I'd better ask some serious, knowledgeable Jew, which I surely wasn't, whether this made sense or was totally crazy. So I asked around, got the name of a young rabbi in Washington, Harold White, who was against the war the U.S. was carrying on in Vietnam and had taken part in some civil rights actions, because I figured if it weren't somebody like that, it was useless to ask. So I called him up, I described what I was doing, and asked him to give me a frank judgment, whether it made sense or was just nuts. So he said, well, it sounds interesting anyway, so send it to me. So I did. He calls me up a week later and he says, I love it. It's an activist midrash on the Haggadah. And it's such an activist midrash. I wonder whether you ever bumped into the ancient rabbinic midrash that God wouldn't split the sea just cause it was a good thing to do. It took an activist who went into the sea up to his nose. He was on the point of drowning. And not till he took that action did God split the sea. And your Haggadah, Freedom Seder, is an activist midrash like that. And I said, what's a midrash? And he, instead of saying, oh, who needs to talk to an ignoramus and Amoritz like you, he said, oh, let me share the midrash with you. And he explained what it was and then sent me Nachum Glatzer's wonderful little book called Hammer on the Rock, which is a collection of brilliant midrash. And I was just enthralled. Not only was the politics of the Seder and the politics of many of the prophets wonderful, and that fit with who I'd become politically, but also the idea that you could take a 3,000-year-old text and give it a twirl, and it would come out new and fresh and alive. That was amazing. And those two things came together, and they turned me into a serious Jew. And I found myself learning and teaching and creating a Judaism that wasn't in the books, but was in the books if you knew how to read the white fire, as the rabbi used to say. The Torah wasn't written in black ink on white parchment. It was written in black fire on white fire. And you had to learn to read the black fire and read the white fire. The blank spaces, you had to learn to read them. And so that's what I found myself doing. So that's affected the whole rest of my life. I'm afraid, Richard, I specialize in long answers to short questions.
That deserved a long answer, because that's an amazing story, and so much has happened since then. It's amazing that if the military wasn't on your street and all, who knows what was. Right. Thank God it did, because you've made such a difference since then. So from that beginning, what led you to form the Shalom Center? What are the objectives? What you've been doing with the Shalom Center, and what about future plans for the Shalom Center?
Well, I was invited by the second president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, Iris Silverman, Oliver Shalom, to come teach there because he got to know me in Washington as I began to develop a whole pattern of Jewish life that was different from the official pattern, but that he liked and that he thought Reconstructionists could learn from. So he invited me to come to Philadelphia to teach there. And I left Washington and came to Philly. And he was also the leader of the New Jersey campaign for nuclear disarmament. And in that year, 82, maybe a year before, the Catholic bishops of America issued a very good pastoral letter about the bomb and the nuclear arms race. But there was no Jewish voice. Nobody in the Jewish community was ready to address that. And there were a couple of foundations that were really interested in what a Jewish look at the nuclear arms race might result in. They started looking for people who had begun to think about it. I had started a magazine called Numenora Sparks of Jewish Renewal in Washington before I came to Philly. And in it, I had begun to develop a whole midrashic. I did learn what midrash was, a whole midrashic notion out of the midrash about a flood of fire. The story of the midrash is that when Abraham saw Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed by fire, he said to God, first of all, Abraham, he saw Sodom and Gomorrah, he thought it was the whole world getting burned up. So he said to God, you promised not to do that. You said you would never destroy the earth. And then Abraham pauses and says, wait a minute, you promised never to destroy the earth by water. That doesn't mean that you'd be willing to destroy by fire. How terrible. So he's arguing with God, as Abraham did every once in a while. And the whole notion of a flood of fire entered Jewish tradition. It even entered, maybe it was learned from Jewish tradition, or maybe it was learned from reality, Black tradition. James Baldwin wrote a book called The Fire Next Time, from a song that went, God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water, the fire next time. So we developed that and pointed out that this was not like war. It didn't matter. Past a certain small number of H-bombs, didn't matter whether you had more than your enemy. Maybe in a regular war, if you had more weapons than your enemy, you're more likely to win. But this one, it didn't matter because you could destroy everything with very few. And you can't fight fire with fire because all you accomplish is more burning everything up. And we use that whole thing to develop that whole midrash, to develop a way of thinking about the bomb. So when the foundations, small foundations, wanted to find a Jewish voice, there already was a small one. And I was teaching at that point at the Reconstructionist College, and they came to talk to me and to Iris Silverman, who already cared about this as just as an American and a human, as well as a Jew. And we proposed to them that we set up a center, we called it the Shalom Center, that would work on that issue. And they said, well, why should we do that at the Reconstructionist College? It was small and not very famous then, and so on. And I said, if you put it at the Reform Seminary, the conservatives won't play. If you put it at the conservative seminary, the Reform people won't play. But nobody is afraid of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. It's too small, too new. And you could put it here and everybody will play. Even the Orthodox will play, and they did. Walter Wurzburger, Allah Shalom, though he did say after a couple of years that his friends were teasing him. Oh, Walter, you've become a Reconstructionist? And at that point, partly for that reason, we made the Shalom Center independent from the college and any other single institution. But that's what formed the Shalom Center, was the question of the bomb. And meanwhile, in the world at large, thank God, the United States and the Soviet Union figured out how to limit, at least have arms control, though not real disarmament, but arms control. And the nuclear race to destruction calmed down and flattened out. And we asked ourselves, so what do we do now? And that was just at the point when the danger of the climate crisis was becoming really public. And we realized, I remember realizing the last line of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland was, this is the way the world ends.
Not with a bang.
This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. And I realized that the bomb was a bang, but the climate crisis was a whimper. It might very well end the world because nobody would know how to cope with a whimper. So we turned our attention there. And I remember also being invited to speak at a synagogue in Philadelphia, which still kept the second paragraph, the traditional second paragraph of the Shema, which says that what human beings do will have an effect on whether the rain comes when it should, and the forests grow when they should, and the crops grow when they should. And a very smart Jew, Mordecai Kaplan, said, that's not true, and took it out. But it was true, but nobody really realized it until the crisis became so big that people couldn't avoid it. So I was invited to speak about Jewish radicalism at this shul, and somebody, the shul read the second paragraph. It was a conservative shul, and they didn't drop it. And I suddenly woke up. Wait, wow, that's right there. It says that what we do matters to the earth. And we've gotten so big for our britches that what we do really matters. The human race really matters. And has become dangerous to the rest of the planet and to ourselves, for that matter. So then I began paying attention, real attention, to the climate crisis, and began working out and realized, although Rabbinic Judaism turned away from earth questions, I think clearly because, first of all, the Jewish people was expelled from the land, underlined land of Israel, and from every land or any land. I mean, over and over again, some country would say, "We don't want you around anymore. Goodbye, get out." And so it felt useless to rabbinic Judaism for a couple thousand years. It felt useless to worry about or think about or feel about connection to the land. But if you look back at the Bible, these are shepherds and farmers, and they knew that everything in their lives depended on their relationship with the land, and it was a sacred relationship. And they taught about it, they spoke about it, they acted it. The way they got in touch with God was not in doing words of midrash, but by bringing food from the land to the temple, burning it, which put it into, I began to think about Yud Hey Vav Hey as the breath of life, because I tried once, almost by accident, pronouncing Yud Hey Vav Hey, which my grandmother had forbidden me to do when I was 11 years old. She taught me it was Adonai, and I said, "But there's no Dalet, there's no Nun. You just taught me a Dalet and a Nun. Can't be." And she said, "I know, just do it." So I just did it for a long time, and then I tried pronouncing it, and all that came out was a breath.
Mm-hmm.
I realized a breath, that's the only universal thing in every human language. And it's more than just human language. Every living being on the planet breathes. The plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. And the animals breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. This interbreathing, that's what life is on the planet. And we have now poisoned it by making so much CO2 that all the plants in the world can't absorb it and turn it back into oxygen. So it builds up and builds up and builds up, and it's a heat trapping gas, so it heats the planet. And we get hotter and hotter, and we begin to see what the disasters are. So I found myself turning to the question, well, what do we do about it? And there are a series of things. One has been that I thought synagogues could become sponsors of solar energy co-ops in their neighborhoods. They could bring people together who not only were doing something technological, but something political and social and loving. Create a co-op and you start caring about each other. And the biggest problem beneath the technological problem of CO2 is the spiritual problem of greed. That you can hardly imagine that a corporation would choose deliberately to make tons more money by burning the earth to destruction. But that's exactly what they've been doing, and that's greed. So if there's any spiritual question, it's the question of love versus greed. And if there's any place in America and most other societies where how to focus on love is at least a question, an issue, it's in the communities of faith. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, all of them try to teach that greed and envy. I mean, the 10th of the great 10 utterances that came from Sinai, which people say is the hardest one to obey or connect with, is don't envy, don't covet. And that's what really leads to the climate crisis. And it's also a crisis in the interbreathing of the planet. So I've been teaching that what we call the climate crisis is really a crisis in Yud Hey Wov Hey. It's a crisis in God's name. And it's no accident that it's such a deep crisis that it's troubling the entire structure of the ecosystem that's at Earth. So there's where I am. And I have been encouraging moving our money out of investing in burning the planet and moving it into life-giving enterprises. I know and honor what you have done so consistently. I love the insistence on focusing on the huge destructive results of raising millions of animals for meat and even for dairy purposes, and how to shift what we eat. I mean, the question is any beef kosher? I mean, a real question. I love one of the things in the Talmud. The Talmud said, we must not raise sheep and goats in the land of Israel. Hey, that's chutzpah. I mean, Abraham, Isaac, all those folks, they were raisers of sheep and lambs. How can you say don't do it? Well, they realized that too many people raising sheep and goats in a small land, a small country, were ruining it, destroying it. And they said, stop. Well, if the planet can't absorb millions of farm animals, then
absolutely.
Makes sense. Say stop.
Your opinion related to all of that, like you said before, so much carbon dioxide, plants can't absorb it. And glad you're now getting on to the very negative effects of animal agriculture. Now, it turns out there used to be 6 trillion trees in the world. Now we're down to 3 trillion because about 43% of the ice-free land area is used now for grazing and growing feed crops for animals. Makes it worse is that the increasing production of animals means it's still destroying the tropical rainforest. We're literally eating ourselves to extinction in a way. So what do you think of the argument that the only possible way, and the chances of getting slimmer, as you know, by the day, and Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we may have only till 2030 to make tremendous changes. But anyway, what do you think of the possibility, if that is the only way perhaps to avert a climate catastrophe, is to reduce that carbon dioxide? The atmosphere of carbon dioxide has reached 420 parts per million, and the climate experts have been saying that 350 parts per million is like a threshold, and we're way above that, increasing 2 to 3 parts per million per year. So the only possible way is a major shift toward plant-based diets that will stop the deforestation now, which is very, very negative, and enable reforestation. Millions and millions of trees, as you know, as you've been saying, sequester and absorb that carbon dioxide and hopefully bring it down to a much safer level. What do you think of
Well,
that as an approach to
Richard,
push?
the only thing I disagree with you about is when you say the only way. I
Mm,
think that there are a series of misuses of human ingenuity that have brought us here,
mm,
powered by greed. I
right.
mean, it's no accident that, opening a cow farm or a pig farm can make you a lot of money if you do it in a corporate way, not in a family farm way. So the greed to make more money uh, permeates what we eat, but it
Absolutely.
also permeates how we warm our houses, how we
Right.
get around in the cars. So I think it's one of the major, but not the only way.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. Many other things have to happen, but what I'm saying is, if that does not happen, is there any possibility of averting a climate catastrophe? Because in addition to what we've been saying about the destruction of the trees, and you've mentioned carbon dioxide, again, very important greenhouse gas, but the methane from cows. And they say that is over 80 times as potent per unit weight in heating the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. And the methane's only in the atmosphere 10, 15 years, has a very short half-life. So if we can get rid of that, because carbon dioxide's in the atmosphere hundreds of years, maybe more than 1,000 years. So even if we reduce it now, the carbon dioxide will still be there. But
It's certainly one of, and a major one of. I'm not dismissing it at all. But it's even the methane question is not just
absolutely,
animal farming. I mean, the whole fracking way of
other things.
unnatural gas, what I call unnatural gas. If you have to pour thousands of tons of chemicalized water on rocks to break them up and release the gas in them, that's not natural gas. That's very unnatural gas. And it always releases a lot of methane too.
But Arthur, I think everybody pretty much knows that we've got to reduce fossil fuels. You know, people talk about zero emissions, so that they're pushing for, and that is definitely essential. But many people do not know the negative effects of animal-based agriculture. And so, of course, it's very difficult because people are so used to that kind of food, and their parents had it, and all, it's a tradition. But as you know, also, there are now many plant-based substitutes that have the texture, appearance, and taste so close to the meat and other animal products that even longtime meat eaters can't tell the difference. So now there's really no justification. Before, people can say, I know terrible what they're doing to the animals, negative my health, I love the taste so much, but now they can get it without eating meat. And every day there's reports on, thankfully, Israel is really a major player in the plant-based substitute area. And also, as you know, they have much research on cultured meat, or meat from the cells of animals. So this is so essential. So I'm wondering if the Shalom Center would consider making this one of the major issues that you promote.
Well, I think we have made it one of, and absolutely think of it as one of the major ones. I mean, there are several major sectors of human behavior that are making the destruction. So the whole question of how you nurture love rather than greed, how you convince people that the greed for money is what is destructive, and then look at the big places where that has proved destructive. And animal farming, I think, is one of them. And gasoline-powered cars and oil and coal-powered houses are another, and oxygen are another. So those areas. And then the question of whether aiming at the mechanism of greed turned into the use of money and the lending of money deliberately to make this whole story worse, whether that is a strategic focus. So I think all of that's going to be necessary. I've even begun to, about 10 years ago, some folks came to me wanting to talk about truly radical action to get CO2 out of the atmosphere and to restore the climate of 1850 or thereabouts. And I was very skeptical. I worried that just as we have seen what could have been nurturing technologies turn to destruction, that people who run big corporations might well use technologies that were intended to restore life to the oceans and to the Arctic and so on, would instead destroy. But for 10 years, the world, including the United States and China and Russia, have done so little that we've wasted more than 10 years. We know now that the inner staff of Exxon Corporation knew in the mid-70s what their business plan was doing to the earth. And they had a choice. Either they could go public and say, well, we're getting out of this. We'll take 10 years to get out of the business of burning the earth, and we'll start putting energy into energy that was life-giving. Or they could lie and pay other people to lie. And they chose to lie and to keep on with the old pursuit.
Right. Okay. One final question, because try to keep this under an hour, and we're heading toward that. So I want to know what your future plans are, and what are the future plans for the Shalom Center to try to avert this climate catastrophe. I agree with you that if we can't solve the climate catastrophe, everything else will be very relatively unimportant. And you probably agree, as the UN Secretary General was called a code red for humanity and said to lay his death, as you know, we don't have that much time. And unfortunately, every year the carbon dioxide is going up. So what the Shalom Center has done such tremendous work. What are your plans to turn things around?
We've decided to try to make a stronger focus on something we've been doing sporadically and sort of ad hoc. We have used Pesach and Tisha B'Av. We talked about Tisha B'Av, more than talked, acted Tisha B'Av as mourning, grief for Temple Earth, not just for the temple in Jerusalem, a couple thousand and more years ago, but the temple is burning in front of our eyes.
Right. By the way, you had an article in the Jerusalem Post entitled, "Will we fail to heed the warnings again?" Using the kind of analogy, they didn't listen to Yirmiyahu, to Jeremiah, and we don't have Nevi'im prophets today, but we have thousands and thousands of climate experts warning And it's not just their warnings, we see the facts on the ground, temperatures going up. By the way, I'm now living in Israel, and the projections are for this summer, possibly 2 or 3 times for 3 or 4 days, temperatures of 49 degrees Celsius, which is 120 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right.
And we see reports all the time where the lakes, the rivers are drying up, the wildfires, and unfortunately, as you know, there's the positive feedback loops or vicious cycles
Right.
that make it even more likely.
So we've decided to focus on the festival cycle, to focus for Pesach on the modern corporate carbon pharaohs, bringing plagues on the whole earth, not just on a little sliver of land on the Eastern Mediterranean. We've decided to focus for Hanukkah on what it means to light, using conserving energy. I remember sitting in my backyard one day, must have been about 12 years ago, and muttering to myself, I wish there was a Jewish holy day about conserving oil. And the trees practically in the backyard, they yelled at me, Watzko, what's wrong with you? There is a Jewish festival about conserving oil. It's so, and Tisha B'Av about protecting Temple Earth and so on. And we think that the focus on the intense holidays, the holy days, would attract a lot of people who don't know what to do and who think that the holidays have become meaningless. They're not about anything they care about. There's this semi-joke, but there's a truth deep in it. All the holidays, the line goes, in all the holidays we remember, they tried to kill us, we want, let's eat. Well, that sounds like just a joke, but there's a truth that we face death, we face the Jewish people has, now the human race does, and life on the planet does, faces death. And we need to use the holidays, which have always been about transcending the threat and taking joy and community and eating, but it ought to be eco-kosher eating. And by the way, you said something about, well, we don't have prophets like Jeremiah. I don't think that's true. I think we just use a rule that says we can't call people like you prophets, but that's stupid. I mean, if people insist on using deep truths of the tradition and deep truths of spiritual life and affirming life instead of death, that's what a prophet does. And so you do it, and other people do it. Many different traditions, even many people do it.
By the way, you do it very, very much. I regard you as one of the modern prophets, actually.
Well, so we should encourage people to become modern prophets and to speak out, even as the rabbis did when they said, you must not grow sheep and goats anymore in the land of Israel because you're going to destroy the land. Well, let's learn what that means. How chutzpah to say is not Abraham was a bad guy, but to imitate him too much is a bad thing. So we have a big job. I think the food question is a big part of it, but other questions as well. We ought to be about it. And I think you're inventing the way of using this new technology, the Zoom technology, to bring these ideas further out, a prophetic decision.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Arthur. You've raised so many points. both enjoy talking to you and so much more, but maybe somewhere down the line, I'm hoping to interview, as I said, many activists in the environment and vegetarianism and all, and maybe somewhere down the line we'll have another interview. So again, as I said before, you've been a hero and inspiration to me. I've read so many of your books and they've been wonderful, and probably I'm sure many of your ideas have gotten into my own books. So I want to thank you very much and forward. And by the way, this is going to be recorded and we'll send you a link and we'll try to send it widely.
We'll send it out. We will absolutely send it out to our folks.
Yeah, so we'll
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for all the work you've done for decades now. And thank you for continuing to do it.
Absolutely, because as you said, there's no alternative, and from one more, I think the environmentalists are saying there's no planet B.
Yes, right.
So we got to do it. Okay, so many, many thanks, and we'll be in touch. And again, we'll send you out the link when it's ready, and I'm sure we'll both share it very widely. So, hello from Israel, and keep up your wonderful work. Say well. I know we're both in the 89-year category, and as they say, I've made it for Esrim. On to 120. Okay, so Kotuv, many, many thanks, and keep up your wonderful work.
You too. Thank you, Richard. You will.